There were many threats to a pioneer family. Sickness and infection could hit at any time, and there was not the same modern medicines and facilities we have today. The damp that we learned about as they dug their wells was a toxic gas that settled in the bottom of a well and was incredibly dangerous and unexplained for many years. Wild animals were prevalent, and families had to be vigilant that cougars, mountain lions, wolves, and bears did not see the family homestead as their personal hunting grounds. There was a reason that the western frontier was called the Wild West, as each family fought to carve their legacy into an unknown and at times inhospitable environment. Perhaps one of the greatest challenges an early pioneer faced was not just establishing a new home, but protecting and defending it. Let's take a closer look at how they did that. Pioneer families would bring a shotgun with them on their journey west, but it was generally saved for the most grave circumstances. Making ammunition was a lot of work, and in the early years of settlement, there were no local stores to replenish your stock. Because of this, pioneers got creative when it came to wild animals. Number one, the family dog in those days was less of a pet lounging on its bed in the corner and more of a valuable asset. Dogs were a source of protection. They gave advance warning and were useful in hunting. Number two, one of the first tasks of settlement was to build a shelter and fence for the livestock that had been brought along on the journey. This was not just meant to keep the animals in so they would not roam onto a neighboring property, but also to keep predators out. Because time was of the essence in their first year, stump fences were not uncommon, and they were a way of repurposing the large stumps that had been dug out of the ground in order to clear a garden or homestead space. Number three, traps, pits, and snares were all useful forms of perimeter defense and hunting. Number four, still to this day, loud noises are often the most effective way of scaring off a large predator. Pioneer families would bang on hollow logs or even empty pots to ward off a bear or cougar, or perhaps their barking dog would do the trick. One of the most unique aspects of living off the land was that many things were multi-purpose and used in many different ways or capacities. Protection from wild animals also served as a means for hunting food that could last the winter. Though it was risky, an encounter with a bear could mean meat for an entire season. Isn't it amazing how something that could be bad, scary, or awful can also be used for good? Today we have a government that passes laws, police officers that enforce the laws, and a judicial system that interprets and applies the laws. While the United States of America has its own government, there was very little representation of it in the West in the early years, other than land surveyors whose job was to make sure the requirements of the Homestead Act had been met. Pioneer families banded together with their neighbors to help protect their area. As time went on, they often formed governing councils and created codes of conduct or their own justice system. Border disputes were common. Raids and kidnapping were a risk, especially during the early 1800s. Theft was an ongoing issue. The family shotgun had a prominent place, often above the doors or just inside, where it could be easily accessed in case of an unwelcome visitor. With very few fair trials, one could never be too careful in the West. Western territories were often seen as land to cross over for pioneers unless you dealt with cattle. The Wild West, parts of Colorado, Texas, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, contained miles and miles of pasture land for huge herds of cattle. It wasn't until Indians were put on Indian reservations that these lands were even considered safe for anyone other than the gun-slinging cowboys you might think of when you hear the term Wild West. In truth, these men traveled great distances on horseback, continually moving their herds to new grazing lands. They protected the herd from cattle thieves, raiding Indians, and from dehydration and starvation. It maybe wasn't quite the glamorous life Hollywood has made it, but they really did help settle and win the West. Guns were considered a necessity for protection in the 1800s. As time went on, some people grew concerned that guns were linked to increased violence. They would be called Democrats. Even today, this remains a hot-button issue with very strong opinions on both sides. Some insist that gun control is necessary. Again, those are Democrats. While others feel it infringes on their rights and will not solve the problem. What do you think? Talk about it as a family, and if you want, do some additional research on gun control in your state, province, or county. Early American guns were not as easy, safe, or accurate as their modern counterparts today. Unlike the bolt, break, or pump-action rifles we have today, they had to be manually loaded and carefully maintained. They took quite a bit of time to load and ran the risk of misfiring. Flint-rock rifles required the use of a horn of gunpowder, which was carefully measured and poured into the muzzle. Once the gunpowder was in place, a patch or a cut and lubricated piece of cloth was wrapped around a lead ball so a good seal could be made. This was pressed down the barrel with a ramrod to nestle it close to the gunpowder, whose job was to propel it forward and hopefully toward the mark. A small amount of gunpowder would also go into the pan, which was lit as the flint struck the frizzen. By 1861, the first repeating rifle was introduced. This was the first in a long list of improvements and modifications that continued to change the gun industry and the life of pioneers, cowboys, and even city dwellers. As time went on, guns and ammunition became more commonplace and more affordable. Ammunition was made by melting down lead with a bit of tin and pouring it into a mold. It was tedious, and lead wasn't always available. In the early years before town shops and gunsmiths had settled in the region, men usually carried a knife that could be used for protection or as a tool as well. Not as big or cumbersome as a rifle, a knife was easily used for protection in more close-range scenarios, though perhaps not the best tool when facing off with a black bear. As time went on, more reliable and accurate guns were manufactured. From the pistols you likely imagine when you consider the Wild West to revolving rifles, gunsmiths were always looking for ways to improve upon the original design. Throughout this unit, we have been covering a broad timeline of events. From first settlers and explorers, sometime in the 1700s, to the Homestead Act bringing droves of people over in the mid to late 1800s, time was changing not only the landscape, but also the relationships and way of life. It is important to remember that every family and people group was unique and different, with their own ideas and response to westward expansion. Many newly minted Americans were in favor of moving Indians to reservations, either out of fear or racism. However, other families had good relationships with a local tribe or group, friendships even, and did not agree with the Indian Appropriations Act. The same was true of the other side. Some Indians were violently opposed to the new settlers who were a threat to their way of life and established territories. Kidnappings and attacks were not uncommon, especially in some areas. Not all Indians felt or responded the same way. Some became interpreters and friends to their new neighbors, helping them learn about the flora and fauna and even trading with them. Painting a large group of people with one label is called stereotyping, and it is not uncommon to stereotype early America as inherently racist or Indians as violent or uncivilized. These are simply not true. The loudest story is not always the most trustworthy. Early America was more a battleground for identity than anything else, and there are always two sides to every story. Take some time to discuss the different viewpoints and motivations of both Indians as well as the pioneers and early settlers.